Welcome back to the Dieu Han channel, where every silence hides a secret, and every shadow tells a story. This is a place for those who feel deeply, love quietly, and carry memories no one else sees. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know. So take a breath, lean in, and let's walk together through another chapter, one filled with mystery, emotion, and the quiet strength of survival. Inside the car, the hum of the engine was the only sound. Then stared out the window, his thoughts spiraling. The woman they'd just seen, there was something painfully familiar about her. Not her face, but the way she moved, the way she kept her eyes down. A flicker of memory brushed past his chest, a shadow long buried. He closed his eyes, heart heavy, afraid to name what it might be. Dieu Han's voice cut through the silence. She had turned around in her seat, a worried look on her face. She asked if Then was okay, noticing how quiet he had been. He forced a smile, nodded. He couldn't let her know. Not now. Not here. Some truths weren't meant to be unearthed, especially not when they had just barely begun to feel safe again. The woman outside, it wasn't just pity Dieu Han felt, it was recognition. She saw her old self reflected in that hunched figure, hungry, hopeless, invisible. And perhaps that woman had been placed there for a reason, to remind her, or to deliver something else, a message, a warning. Than's silence only deepened the mystery. Why did he look so lost? Than reached for the rearview mirror, adjusting it without reason. His fingers trembled slightly. Dieu Han kept watching him, and certain, she finally asked about the woman again. Did he think they should have done more? But then shook his head, said she'd be fine, just someone passing by. He said it too quickly, firmly, like he needed to believe it himself. The truth was clawing at the edges of Than's mind. He remembered a rainy night, a young girl, frightened and barefoot, running down a narrow alley. He had helped her once, or maybe failed her. He didn't know, or didn't want to know. Guilt had a way of twisting memory, and that woman outside felt like a ghost of something left undone. Dieu Han leaned her head against the window, exhausted. She murmured something about how everyone's life had a turning point, a person, a moment, a choice. Than's heart clenched. Was he her turning point, or was someone else once his? The thought scared him. He didn't answer, just kept driving. The road stretched out endlessly. Ahead, behind them, the lights of the town slowly faded. Dieu Han had already moved on, talking to Tom, smiling faintly, but then still carried the weight. The woman outside hadn't just taken Dieu Han's kindness, she had taken a piece of his past with her. And if that past returned one day, Than wasn't sure what it would bring with it. What was she really doing there? Was it coincidence or design? Was Dieu Han meant to see her, or was Than meant to remember? The questions lingered as they drove into the unknown. One thing was certain, some stories don't end, they hide, waiting, watching, and when they return, they demand to be seen. Some people pass by us like shadows, silent, fleeting, yet unforgettable. If today's scene touched something in you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who might need to feel seen. And if you've ever crossed paths with a stranger who left an impact, leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next chapter in Dieu Han's journey. The car rolled slowly into the silence of the night. Darkness enveloped the road, and the world outside became nothing but shadows. Dieu Han and Tom were fast asleep, their breaths soft and steady. Then parked quietly at a remote rest area, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to hold himself together. Long hours on the road, and a storm of thoughts had drained him beyond words. He stepped out of the car, the cold night air brushing against his skin. The silence was thick, almost pressing down on him. Then walked a few steps away, looking out at the empty road ahead. But his mind wasn't here. It was stuck on the face of that woman, her bent back, her quiet eyes, her tired hands. Why did it feel like a memory he didn't want to remember? Or worse, something he had once tried to forget? He had always been the strong one, the protector, the silent guardian. But that night, something cracked inside him. The face of that woman wasn't just familiar, it was haunting. Was it guilt, regret, or fear that the past was finding its way back to him? He leaned against the car, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. And in that moment of weakness, then realized he wasn't just protecting Dieu Han from danger. He was running too. The sound of the car door opening snapped him out of the spiral. Dieu Han stepped out slowly, rubbing her eyes, sensing the tension in the air. She walked to his side, her presence grounding, though her face was still half dreaming. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. Then forced a smile, nodding. "Just needed some air," but the truth was heavier than that. The night didn't just bring cold. It brought memories that refused to fade. They stood together in silence, the kind that said more than words ever could. Dieu Han looked up at him, sensing the weight in his eyes. "You've done so much for us," she whispered. "I know you're tired," then didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then looked away. "Some journeys don't end even when the road does," he murmured. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but something in his voice felt. "And finished." She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Whatever you're holding in, you don't have to carry it alone." That hit deeper than she knew. Then gave a small nod, but inside, the storm was far from over. He had buried that part of himself for years, sealed it under promises and silence. But tonight, one glance at a stranger had cracked open what he thought was gone. And Dieu Han, she was getting closer to the truth. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves nearby. Then turned back toward the car. "You should go back inside. Tom might wake up." But Dieu Han stayed where she was, watching him. "I saw her too," she finally said. "The woman. Something about her reminded me of myself. Like a version of me that almost didn't make it." Her voice trembled slightly. And then he couldn't bring himself to speak. Dieu Han quietly returned to the car, closing the door gently so Tom wouldn't stir. Her warmth faded into the night, leaving them alone once more. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then stood still, eyes staring into the void, heart drifting elsewhere. The memories came not in waves, but in fragments. He didn't fight them this time. Something inside told him to stop running. So, he let himself fall into that one moment, the day everything began to change. It was years ago. The sun was high, laughter echoed through a grassy hillside. Than was younger, freer, with two friends he trusted deeply. One was a cheerful boy with bright eyes and endless jokes. The other, his girlfriend, graceful and full of life. The three of them were inseparable then. That afternoon, they had escaped the world, chasing the wind, throwing pebbles into a stream. The laughter was real, the kind that came before people grew up and secrets were born. They lay in the grass, watching clouds drift like slow-moving dreams. The boy was telling a story half true, half fantasy, and both then and the girl were laughing until their eyes watered. Then, in one still moment, the boy got up to chase a butterfly, then stayed behind. And so did she. The grass swayed between them, and the world grew quieter. She looked at him, eyes soft, voice low. "You're different when you're quiet," she said, almost teasing, then smiled shyly but didn't answer. The silence between them wasn't awkward, at least, not at first. But then, her hand reached out, brushing against his. It wasn't accidental. It lingered. Then froze, eyes on her hand, unsure whether to pull away or hold on. His heart raced, not out of love, but confusion, guilt. A line had blurred, and though nothing was said, everything changed in that instant. He broke eye contact and laughed nervously. She didn't say a word either. But her eyes held something, a question, maybe a wish. Then quickly pointed to the clouds. "That one looks like a fish," he said, voice a bit too loud. She smiled, and just like that, the moment passed. The boy returned laughing, and sat between them. The girl leaned into her boyfriend like nothing had happened. But then knew. He had felt something shift, deep beneath what they pretended was simple friendship. Years later, then would wonder if she remembered that day, that moment, or if she had buried it like he tried to. The three of them drifted apart not long after. Life pulled them in different directions, and no one really said goodbye. But something from that day never left him. It wasn't love. It wasn't betrayal. It was the beginning of knowing that people can feel too much, too quietly, and never say a word. The night wind rustled the trees around him, pulling them back to the present. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and looked at the dark road ahead. It was always the past, creeping in when he least expected. Was it because of the woman earlier? Or because Yuhan was starting to look at him with those same questions in her eyes? Either way, something was waking up inside him. Something he wasn't ready to name. Then returned to the car, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that echoed louder in his chest than in the quiet night. His hands gripped the wheel, but his heart was somewhere else, clamped tightly between memory and regret. The beautiful fragments of youth had resurfaced like ghosts uninvited, and timely. He pressed his lips together, forcing himself back into the present. Yuhan and her child were sleeping. That was reality. And that was what needed him now. The car moved forward again, swallowed by the long road stretching into the early hours. Then didn't turn on the music. He let the hum of the engine keep him company, the only sound steady enough to hold onto. His eyes stayed sharp, but his thoughts were anything but. The woman earlier, Yuhan's face, that distant afternoon they collided in his chest like waves. And still, he drove. Driven not just by duty, but by something heavier. Something closer to guilt. The sky was turning pale when he finally pulled over. A small roadside stall stood lonely under the morning haze. Then stepped out, legs stiff, mind heavier. He ordered a black coffee, extra strong. He needed something bitter to match the mess inside his chest. As he waited, he looked back at the car. Inside, Yuhan and Tom were curled in sleep, peaceful and touched. He closed his eyes for a second, not from exhaustion but from the ache of trying to be strong. The first sip burned his tongue, but he welcomed the sting. It cut through the fog in his mind, snapping him back to now. The bitter taste anchored him. This wasn't the time to drift. He couldn't afford it. Not when Yuhan trusted him. Not when a child slept under his care. He glanced at the horizon, colors rising slowly. A new day. And perhaps, a chance to do something right for once. He exhaled, long and slow, letting the warmth of the cup steady his grip. He returned to the car, coffee in hand, heart still heavy but steadier. The world was waking up slowly, but inside that vehicle, time was still paused. Then opened the driver's door, glanced once more at Yuhan's resting face, and settled back into his seat. His hands on the wheel again, his jaw set. There would be no more wandering thoughts. Not today. Whatever those memories meant, they could wait. Right now, the road ahead was all that mattered. The next sip of coffee lingered on his tongue, just as his soft voices stirred in the back seat. Yuhan slowly opened her eyes, stretching with a quiet smile. Tom followed, his eyes blinking fast, cheeks round with sleep. Then turned around, heart lifting. No words were said, but something in that small family scene melted his chest. After everything, this piece felt like a reward. He had driven thousands of kilometers, and now it all made sense. Tom giggled, rubbing his eyes, and reached out instinctively for Than. That small hand, chubby and warm, landed on Than's arm like a jolt. He froze, then smiled. His throat tightened. Yuhan laughed quietly, brushing Tom's hair. The moment was simple, but it sank deep into Than's chest like a stone in water. He wasn't the child's father. He wasn't even a close friend for long. But this connection, this shared warmth was something no distance could erase. The road ahead grew familiar, and Yuhan's face softened as the scenery turned to places she once called home. The village was quiet in the early sun, just rising gently with the breeze. Then felt her shift beside him. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But there was something sacred in the silence, the kind shared between people who had survived something together. Then she looked at him, and that was enough. They had made it. The car came to a gentle stop. Then stepped out first, taking a deep breath of the countryside air. It wasn't his home, but the moment felt grounding. Dieu Han followed, holding Tom in one arm and a bag in the other. Without needing to speak, then grabbed their things from the back. The three of them walked slowly toward the house. It was simple, worn by time, but it held something precious: safety. Something they all needed more than ever. They reached the steps when Dieu Han paused, shifting Tom on her hip and turning to Than with a soft smile. "Thank you." Her eyes said it before her lips did. He nodded, lifting the last bag. But before he could follow her in, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was sharp, sudden. He froze. The timing was wrong. So wrong. He stared at the screen. No name. Just a number. But his instinct screamed louder than any ringtone. He hesitated. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of early morning soy and something colder. A chill ran down his spine. His thumb hovered above the screen. Then he answered. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate. Every word was chosen. Than's body went rigid. He turned away from the house instinctively, stepping a few paces back. Something was wrong. Something was starting again, and it had found him. He didn't respond right away. Just listened. The voice spoke of something he tried to leave behind, something buried under years and miles. But it was back now. Than gripped the phone tighter. His jaw clenched. Behind him, Dieu Han's laughter with Tom echoed faintly. That contrast, it broke him. A perfect moment unraveling as the past knocked again. He whispered a single word into the phone. Then silence. His choice was made. He hung up, slowly. The screen went dark, but the weight of the call remained heavy in his chest. He looked up. Dieu Han was already at the door, waving him over, unaware of the storm he had just swallowed. Than inhaled deeply, squared his shoulders, and forced a smile. There were things he could not tell her, not yet. But for now, he stepped forward, one foot after the other. Because she needed him. And that was enough. There was a flicker in her expression. A quiet knowing. She didn't ask directly, but her silence did. Than took a breath, forcing calm into his voice. Something urgent came up. He said it lightly, but it landed heavy. Could she go in on her own for now? Just for a little while. He would be back soon, maybe. The words tasted like ash, but he kept smiling. Dieu Han didn't move at first. She just looked at him. Then she nodded once. She reached out, taking the rest of her bags from his hand. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but something passed through it: concern, and spoke in sadness, maybe even trust. Then stepped back, watching her walk toward the door. Her steps were steady, but he knew she was worried. Still, she didn't ask more. She had always known how to read silence. It was one of the things that made her impossible to lie to. Tom peeked out, waving excitedly. Dieu Han turned back to smile at them one last time. The smile was soft and sure, almost like a goodbye without saying it. Then stood there for a few more seconds. Every instinct told him to stay. But the phone call was still echoing in his ears. He couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. And not when it might involve what he had once buried deep. He turned away quickly, as if staying a moment longer might unravel his will. His boots crunched against gravel as he made his way back to the car. The sky was brighter now, but in his chest, a shadow loomed. He started the engine, hands trembling just slightly. The road ahead was unknown again, like it always was when the past called. Than didn't look back, not yet. Some goodbyes must be silent. The door creaked open, releasing a stale scent of time and dust. Dieu Han paused at the threshold. Her childhood home now stood faded and worn, with cracked walls and cobwebs clinging to forgotten corners. Each step she took echoed through memories that lingered in silence, mirroring the loneliness she had quietly carried for years. She silently picked up a broom and began to sweep. No complaints, no sighs. Cleaning this space felt like stitching her memories back together, while dusting the wooden shelf. Her hand brushed against something. It was a worn letter, the paper yellowed and fragile, with shaky handwriting, the kind left by someone who had lived through regret. She opened the letter carefully. The first line read, "To my daughter." Her hands trembled. Her heart clenched. Line by line, her father's voice returned. Full of love he never dared to say out loud. He had written this long ago, in silence. When love was too heavy for words. Tears fell, smudging the ink. The letter was short, but it pierced deeply. Dieu Han sat quietly, pressing the letter to her chest. She never knew her father loved her like this. In a world she thought had forgotten her, there had always been a silent light waiting in the dark. A soft wind passed through the window, like her father's voice whispering from the past. Though she sat alone, she no longer felt alone. "I understand now, Dad," she whispered. Her eyes were wet, but they glowed with light. The past and present had just found a way to speak. And that's where we end today's episode. But what does the letter truly mean? Is it a farewell, or a hidden message guiding Dieu Han's next journey? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for Dieu Han's channel. The next chapter may reveal more than we expect.